Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. My name is Emerick, and what a better, a venue for this special occasion to pay tribute to a recording and an artist who I'm sure you have listened to in the past, and I'm sure that most of you have this recording in your music library. Last year with Gwen Ansell, we started a series at the Orbit called Conversations in Orbit. And the purpose of these conversations was to address some serious issues in the music industry, in the jazz scene in particular. And so when Gwen mentioned that this year was 20 years of the recording of Trains to Taung, we thought of doing another of this conversation, which we have called In Discussion with Paul Hanmer. There's going to be some illustrious panelists that Gwen is going to introduce. We're recording tonight because we feel that it's important that we archive this kind of discussions for the future. This is a recording that has marked a number of us, and we feel that it should be useful content for lecturers and other academics at institutions of learning to study and to reflect on. So we hope that in the future we'll get more discussions with more artists around some key recordings that have marked the South African Jazz Songbook. So without further ado, I'm going to leave the floor to Gwen Ansell, who's going to be facilitate the discussions tonight. Thank you.
We've got Paul Hanmer sitting on my extreme right, who is the man who composed and brought together the project. And I'm going to let Paul actually have the last word on the panel after he's heard all the perhaps rather wild speculations that the rest of us are making. Next to him is someone else who was involved with the project, and that's the bassist Abrahamse. On my left, we have Kevin Stuart, who joined Sheer Sound, I think, just shortly after the album came out. And then right next to me, we have Brad Holmes, who was at that time the manager, owner of the Bassline, which is where a lot of the ideas and people who went into this project actually came together and were first heard. Trains to Taung sold 200 copies in its first month. By the time the first year was out, it was selling approximately 1,000 a month. It went gold in May 2002, and it is still selling. Indeed, there are copies of a new vinyl pressing of it outside, which will be available. But it was special for a whole lot of other reasons, other than that it had that characteristic that's really important for a jazz record, which is that it does have that longevity. It was one of, I think, probably two releases in the mid to late 1990s that actually reasserted jazz as a young music, as a pan-African music, as an exciting music, and as a music that could speak across communities in this country at a time when that was a very, very important project. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Abrahamse, who was actually one of the people who made the album, to start talking about those days and that music. Andre.
Thanks, Gwen. Can you hear me? Yeah. There were so many foreigners here interested in what we were doing. People were starting to feel that they could at last do the music that they wanted to do. And it wasn't always just about protest, but maybe about a deeper African thing or whatever. It was free in that sense. And lots of musicians were living here from all parts of the world. It was brilliant. So that was a great place from which many albums came out, and Trains was like leading it off in a way. And the way it came together was like almost accidental in a way. SABC were giving us free airtime, studio time to do projects, right? Okay, it wasn't that free, but I tell you what, it was better than nothing. And out of that grew many, was part of the reason why we could do projects like Paul's, And, you know, I kind of half remember some of the sessions that I did for Paul then. I did a couple more on albums after that I remember more, because at the time that we were doing Trains, recording, not the release date was different from the record date. We were so busy. I was talking to Paul about that our diaries were full. We were doing like 5 nights a week somewhere. If not in Johannesburg, then we were in PE, Cape Town, or we were doing some sessions. It was very busy, you know, and well, it's not so busy now, but that's the way it goes. So, you know, we fitted these things in as we went along. And you know, none of us, I certainly didn't feel that this was a momentous project, but it grew.
One of my best friends, he was the rep at Sheer Sound at the time, Sebastian, who was, who worked with Brad, who was very influential in the early days with Sheer Sound and Paul. And I took over from Seb, and Seb moved to Cape Town, and I sort of became the go-to guy at the company, very young, never worked in the music industry apart from, you know, just retail. And to be around Trains at the time, it's very difficult to really express how intoxicating it was. You know, Paul became a star, and for jazz music, it was unusual. You know, Sheer Sound was this little independent record that had been distributing kind of pixies and smooth jazz and, you know, a couple of other things, Tipo Gumede. But, you know, Trains really put it on the map. It was getting played on radio stations, and not just jazz radio stations, all radio stations, I mean, bar 5 FM. So you could hear it, and people were hearing it. And, you know, it just opened so many doors. And the stories I would hear when I got to Sheer, and he met with Damon Forbes, who was the MD of Sheer up until recently, and Damon saying, listen, man, this is not going to sell more than 500 units, you know, good luck, buddy. But he liked it. And I think that was what was important, that we're a guy from the record industry whose taste actually governed what he put out, as opposed to going, you know, what's the guy's profile, you know, how many gigs is he doing? You know, he just liked it and he put it out. And he worked it hard. And we worked that album. It's also, it's hard to kind of explain to people how you promote an album without social media. Like, people don't really get it anymore.
The thing about, for instance, meeting with Jethro. I met with Jethro in the Market Theatre, in the main theatre, as an audience member. And the person on stage was the late Ray Phiri. And in his band were Jethro Shasha and Louis Mhlanga. And Ray Phiri called me up as a guest. And the people in the band, well, I think Victor Masondo may have been on bass, which helped because Victor and I were friends. But the other guys were a bit mystified. You know, who's this guy that's coming in from the audience to come and play piano now on, you know, Highland Drifter? And that's how I met Louis Mhlanga and Ray Phiri. I mean, and Jethro Shasha. So the way that Jethro Shasha and Denny Lalouette met was in a parking garage under the Johannesburg Library Gardens. Jethro and Louis and I had come from a gig with Ray Phiri. Denny Lalouette had come from a gig with somebody else. And we met in the parking garage underneath. And I saw the way these two guys greeted each other, Denny and Jethro. They had heard about each other, but they had never met until that moment. And it was because of their immediate mutual respect that I thought I must invite these guys to play together on what became known as Trains to Taung. In terms of Trains to Taung, I had been asking my parents at the time, they were both still alive. I was asking them about what songs the Hanmers used to play around the fire. You know, what are the musical roots of my family? Where does it come from? What's the, you know, the fact of discussing with Andre about our grandmothers, eh? You spoke with such confidence about just 3 minutes ago, right? anyway. Obfuscation, you know? Anyway, so we were talking about these things and realized that my grandmother, my father's mother, was probably also from St. Helena and was probably historically a slave, you know, because I'm named after my grandmother in the sense that she was Wilhelmina Polse. So I'm Paul because of her surname. Anyway, but I was asking my parents about the background of the Hanmers and the De Jagers, because my mother is De Jager. And my mother said to me, you know, you should write to the Home Office in London. And I thought, but I'm standing here at home in Crawford, in Cape Town, talking to my mother, and she's telling me to go. And I realized, you know, whatever they've shoved in the cupboard, skeletons and what have you, I'm not really interested. I just want to know information, which only they could give me. And now I can never ask them again. But anyway, at the time, I thought, you know what, I'm not going to even bother with my parents. I'm going to a higher authority. I'm going to an earlier source. And at the time, in 1990, when I wrote Trains to Taung, there was a holographic image of the Taung skull on the cover of the National Geographic magazine. And it was the first holographic image on a cover of any magazine anywhere in the world. And I read there about the paleontologist, excuse my French, who waited, he was about 24, 25 when he made the assumption and the assertion, no, not assumption, the assertion that the skulls that were found at Taung, and there were several of them, were not baboons or monkeys. They were humanoid. And he had to wait until he was in his 80s before the community of academics of which he was part actually accepted what he had said. That humanity arose out of Africa. And for me, that was like, okay, never mind what the Hanmers were playing around the fire. What was everybody playing around the fire? And how long ago were they starting to play it? So I'm going to go there. So that was the idea behind Trains to Taung. Anyway, sorry, I've spoken a lot now.